Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Tina Jha. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is on a 4-day visit to the United Kingdom to participate in the G7 Foreign and Development Ministers meeting. On The Big Picture today, we will talk about the significance of the first in-person G7 meeting in 2 years, which comes amid a pandemic, the issues that will be on the agenda, and what India's participation at the G7 meeting means. So to discuss all of these aspects and much more, I'm joined on the show today by former Ambassador Prabhu Dayal. Welcome to the show, sir. And Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, he's a foreign affairs expert. Welcome, Dr. Chaulia, on this edition of The Big Picture. Dr. Chaulia, what the ambassador says that the invite to India as a guest to the G7 has been a continuous process. France did invite India in 2019, then the United States at last year's summit, which of course could not take place. So as the most prominent grouping of democratic countries, what role does the G7 expect India to play?
Well, you highlighted democracy, Tina. That's a key element, binding the G7 together. In fact, it used to be called G8 earlier, and they expelled Russia for various reasons, including geopolitics and also the concern that it's not democratic. So this is really a club of rich industrialized democracies. And common values and emphasizing democracy, human rights, this become very important cementing factor for it. The G20, of course, is a bigger grouping where China and Russia and many others are also there, and so are we as full members. And as far as economic governance of the world goes, G20 has in a way overtaken G7. But G7 still has relevance because of this democracy factor. It's a very unique club. And the fact that they invited India, Australia, South Korea, this is of course the same countries and ASEAN also indicates one that the summit that is going to happen next month in Scotland will have the heads of states of all these outreach partners. So the same group has also been invited at the foreign ministers level, and people call it G7 plus 3, as in like India, South Korea, Australia, making it G10. Japan is already there as a full member of G7. D10, as in 10 democracies. What does it mean? See, I think they are saying that G7 will look at geopolitical priorities also, apart from what Ambassador mentioned, the corona and crisis and the climate change and such issues. They are saying that they will come with a joint proposal for tackling China, Russia and Iran. And we don't have any, animosity to Russia or Iran, but with China, we do have a problem. And so I think that's where the choice of countries, India, South Korea, Australia, Biden initially called for these to be added on to G7 to make it D10. That's quite clear that the Western countries plus Japan are increasingly looking toward the Indo-Pacific. And so if you see the D10, the full combo, then it's a mix of Europe, North America, and Indo-Pacific countries. So what it indicates is that these countries of the Western world, which is the core of G7, although Japan is there, are looking more and more towards Indo-Pacific as central. So the host country, Britain, of course, they have been talking about Indo-Pacific tilt. The British have done a internal review. They are now sending a carrier strike group to the Indo-Pacific, which will involve military exercises with India and Japan and other Quad members. They are also likely to sign a military logistics agreement with India. So Britain is doing all the right things in the lead up to the main summit, which it's going to be hosting. And the thing that the British are saying is we have to relearn the art of competing against states with opposing values. And the same Antony Blinken, Dominic Raab, all the counterparts of Dr. Jaishankar are saying the same thing. There is a problem with countries that lack democratic values, and we have to challenge them. So, of course, we are going to be selective on this. Like I said before, we don't have any grudge against Russia or Iran, even though they are undemocratic. But as far as this works, this values factor works in creating a common front and a geopolitical thrust in Indo-Pacific area, which will help us to counterbalance China, we will welcome it. So I think a lot of the bilaterals, as well as the main session of the G7 plus 3 or 4 or 5 now, those will focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a welcome move because we want more players involved in this region to create a balance of power. And I think China will be discussed behind closed doors in very frank and candid terms. because the Western world has arisen to the fact that China has become too big of a menace for them. And therefore, that is where the importance of India, Australia, South Korea, and all these countries come in, and ASEAN.
Professor Chaulia, so cooperation among democracies is something which we have seen during the pandemic is back in vogue. Also, to check China's growing assertiveness, this is perhaps in the best interest of the democratic countries which are part of the G7 and the guest countries which are also taking part in the summit. But since we have spoken about talking about the D10 grouping and which the ambassador also spoke about, it's in the best interest of India, Australia, South Korea, because with the rise of Asia, if more and more Asian countries, currently there's just one, with more and more Asian countries joining the G7, it could add value to the diminishing relevance of the G7, isn't it? But what are the challenges in the expansion that you see? We saw US President Donald Trump was quite keen on an expansion, but even then it was unclear whether the expansion will be a permanent one.
Yeah, look, I mean, small group cohesion in these international groupings is important. I mean, always consensus is harder to reach the bigger the group becomes. So internally, some of the members may not be prepared to make it a G10 or a G11 or a D10, if you like. But in any case, there is a G20, which also includes undemocratic countries. But the point is, I think the outreach is more important than the formality. I mean, whether we call it D10 or G7 plus 3 or plus 4, if you include ASEAN, doesn't matter. There are some, doubtful fence sitters in these outreach, party, if you like. One is South Korea. Unlike Japan, which is of course, very firmly ensconced in the US alliance system and opposes Chinese territorial aggression, South Korea has kind of refused. Even the past year, the US was trying to coax South Korea to join the Quad as part of Quad Plus. In some form or the other. South Korea is tiptoeing around that idea because economically it's very heavily dependent on mainland China, and it does not want to upset the trade and investment flows with China. So and the other group, of course, is ASEAN, and it's very important. Their presence at G7 as a guest countries, as a guest grouping, is very important because ultimately Quad plus the Western world cannot succeed unless they get the ASEAN on board. It's because ASEAN is the real bone of contention. So these big 10 countries in the middle between China and the anti-Chinese bloc that is forming. So they are all trying to woo the ASEAN, and ASEAN also is highly dependent on China for many of its economic needs. So even countries that have strong territorial dispute with China, like Vietnam, Philippines, tend to be cautious and not want to be seen to be allying with the US and a broader coalition against China. So I think one of the things for a task for G7 countries, I think India is less confused now because we have more strategic clarity, especially since the LAC crisis we started in 2020. We are not fence sitting and saying we are going to be neutral anymore. No, there's no question of that. Nor are we going to formally become part of an alliance. But that's okay. I mean, as I said, formalities don't matter. Whether we are formally inducted or not is less important than what are we jointly going to do. So Quad Plus, if we can have D10 countries, all of them involved in some way or the other in joint military maneuvers, in interoperability in Indian Ocean region. Like Britain, the host is saying they want to commit more to Indian Ocean. France is there. It's a very important player in Indian Ocean for us. So if we can then just expand this circle of like-minded countries, democracies, and which believe that there is currently a prevailing threat to the global norms. The global norm is receding. Democracy is receding, especially because of China's rise and power and influence around the world. So there has to be a pushback. So at that level, we have to find convergence and do things together. Even with the virus, the vaccines, for example, the initiative of Quad countries to jointly produce vaccines in India. What if we can expand it and have all the G7 plus Quad, make it a D10 initiative with more finance being pulled in to enhance India's capability for vaccine manufacture. One of the official agenda items of G7 summit is this equitable vaccine access around the world, because they're all being criticized. The rich countries are being criticized for not sharing patents, for not being generous enough and all that. So there is a moral onus on them to do more. So I think they are looking to dialogue with India, especially, and with the rest of the Quad countries, because already we have an initiative under Quad, but how to expand it and make it bigger. Why only 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines? We could make 2 billion if the Europeans also pitch in money for it. Right now, the Europeans who are part of G7 have not joined Quad initiative on this matter. So there are such kinds of points of intersection which will benefit humanity and also help us in our geopolitical goal of having a Indo-Pacific and an Indian Ocean that is free of hegemonic Chinese threat.
Dr. Chaulia, one quick question from you, because it is a precursor to the summit that is to take place in June, where the Prime Minister has been invited to take part. What can we expect from the main summit when it takes place in June? Because it comes amid a pandemic, of course, this will be one of the key issues. But apart from that, as the ambassador has pointed out, what else can we expect?
Well, firstly, format. I mean, just imagine the diplomatic circuit has been completely turned upside down due to the pandemic. There have been very, very few physical in-person summits in the last 12, 14 months or so. And the summits have been postponed, or virtual summits. The limitation is the e-diplomacy is okay simply if you have got an agreement in place already and you simply give a pro forma speeches and then you sign it. Or just issue statements or joint declaration. But the actual dialogue, the in-person dialogue, nothing can replace that. Technology cannot. So it's very good that Dr. Jaishankar is personally gone and is there in London, and hopefully Prime Minister can also go in person next month. Because that is where some of the wrinkles can be ironed out, new ideas, there can be some candor among the top leaders. So the summit is going to be very exciting, I think, because the idea of the D10 really hinges on this summit, and it's going to be a landmark summit, because in the past, the geopolitical environment was different when India used to be invited. But this time there is a more focus, as I said, between the West and the Indo-Pacific countries in Asia. So I think the foreign minister is going to lead the spade work for the summit and for some formal announcements. And maybe there is a new pact around a few of the issues that Ambassador outlined. But most important is in-person summits have to return. And I think the British are gambling because they're saying this is a biosecure, it's like a bubble they're creating at the venue for the foreign ministers summit to prove that, it is risk-free as far as the pandemic and infection goes, because top leaders cannot risk their, health at all in this time of global crisis and national crisis. So summit in person, for it to happen, the foreign ministers in person has to happen. So this is like a demonstration or an experiment in returning back to diplomacy as usual. So I think that's very important, and that's worth watching, because we have to maintain the sanctity of this high level, top secret, exchanges and possibilities can only happen in in-person diplomacy. So we hope that this will succeed, and we should welcome this format, because without this, it's all just, as I said, mere formality, and that is not sufficient to push the agendas forward or to resolve conflicts or to create new consensus.
Absolutely. Let's all be hopeful that by the time the summit is to happen, the second wave of the pandemic will be over in the country, will have successfully been able to tide over this crisis that we are currently in. So with that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you once again to both my guests for joining me on the program, sharing your perspective with us and our viewers. Pleasure having you on the program. Take care of yourselves and your families.